There are few more insufferable social media protagonists than the contrarians who are so consumed by the delusion of their open mind that they don't realize they are the useful idiots in a carefully contrived disinformation campaign that specifically targets them due to their self-righteous vulnerabilities. And there is perhaps no better example of the manifestation of this condition than those that confidently proclaim that they are privy to some truth about Russia's irrefutably illegal, immoral, and inhumane hostility towards Ukraine. These living examples of the Dunning-Kruger effect have proudly concluded that it's the former KGB spy who presents as a more reliable source of truth than the overwhelming consensus of every credible geopolitical expert on the planet. And no, economists who spent a decade working for the Kremlin and now get paid by the Kremlin to promote the Kremlin's version of history are not geopolitical experts. Vladimir Putin has ruled over Russia for 26 years by arresting and executing anyone who opposes him, throwing journalists out windows and shutting down any last semblance of independent media. He spent weeks leading up to the invasion denying he was going to do what we could all see him about to do. Now, I genuinely struggle to comprehend why anyone listens to the words of a murderous dictator as though his grievances with the West might be about anything beyond his personal grip on power and the maintenance of one of the most corrupt regimes in history. But here we are. Now, some of these voices that push these narratives, I understand, are just bots, and some we know are influencers that are actually paid by the Russians to promote their narratives. And some, it must be said, are the innocent victims of sustained information warfare, converging with a generation taught from experience and culture to disbelieve any established truth. So let's look at these invented grievances intended to mitigate the immorality of Putin's barbaric and unprovoked war, and let us hope that some good people have the intellectual integrity to correct their misapprehensions and find their way to the right side of history. Grievance 1. Nazis. I'll start with this one because Putin did. It was one of the main reasons he provided for his invasion. In his words, the purpose of this operation, the special military operation, is to protect people who, for 8 years, have been facing humiliation and genocide, I'll get to that part later, perpetrated by the Kiev regime, and for this we will strive for the demilitarization and denazification of Ukraine. Now, are there far-right nationalists in Ukraine? Of course, this pernicious sect is everywhere. In Germany, the UK, and France, the right-wing anti-immigration parties are now so popular they have a meaningful chance of actually forming government. The Netherlands, Austria, and Italy all have strong far-right political movements, and the USA and Australia have regular literal Nazi marches. While in Russia, the rise of skinhead neo-Nazi groups have long been recognized as a serious domestic security issue, with one study estimating that there were as many as 70,000 members of fascist skinhead groups in Russia. That was back in 2008. Now, one of them, Dmitry Utkin, even became the military commander and co-founder of the Wagner Group, providing a clear insight to how this once significant cohort has been amalgamated into the nationalist cause of the state. But what about Ukraine? Well, in the 2019 election, all the far-right parties joined together to increase their chance of electoral success. They won 2.15% of the vote. The guy that won that election with almost 75% of the vote was a socially progressive Jew, elected on a promise of democratic reforms, combating corruption, and closer ties with the European Union. He's their leader of the Nazi regime. Just take as long as you need to think that one through. Now, at this point, even a number of the most committed Kremlin apologists acknowledge that a Nazi regime led by a progressive Jew is a bit silly, which begs the question, if you accept that they're lying to you about this, what else are they lying to you about? Grievance 2. NATO expansion. This one is probably the most ubiquitous, especially by those who believe they've obtained some kind of higher level of consciousness through the apparent revelation that the West are the tyrants of the world and all we were taught to fear is actually benign or even benevolent. But the thing is, sometimes cliches are cliches for a reason. NATO exists for one purpose only, because the nations of Europe fear Russia, and not without cause. Poland, Hungary, Finland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Romania, and the former Czechoslovakia have all been invaded and occupied by Russia in the last 100 years. And while Russia continued to occupy parts of Ukraine, Georgia, and Moldova, it has never attacked a nation after they have joined NATO, which is why so many countries undertake the gargantuan bureaucratic task of applying, lobbying, and carrying out all the reforms necessary to even be considered for NATO, after which every other NATO member must unanimously agree to the new member being admitted. NATO doesn't expand. Nations literally beg to join. And usually it's the USA saying no. But the big question here, though, is why does Russia care? Joining NATO doesn't mean hosting US missile bases. In fact, any country in the world can host US missile bases if it wants to, and there are plenty of NATO members without a single US soldier or weapon. I beg you, read the treaty. It's a collective defense treaty. That's it. It's meaningless unless a member is attacked without cause. Finland is now part of NATO, and its border is only 150 kilometers from St. Petersburg, and Putin doesn't care because he knows that a stable democracy in Finland does not represent the same existential threat to his political system as it does in Ukraine. He needs to be able to control the former Soviet republics through fear. It's why he still has troops in Georgia and Moldova, and how he keeps control of Central Asia, by regularly reminding them that he could send Russian tanks over the border at any time and the world wouldn't stop him. NATO is the holy grail of security guarantees for any society that has spent centuries enduring Russian imperialism. It's absolutely something Putin fears, but only because it prevents his ability to reassert control over the Russian Empire. Oh, and that famous not 1 inch to the east promise from US Secretary of State James Baker to Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev in 1991 that everyone quotes. I'm again begging you, read the whole transcript, not just that one line, because almost everyone who quotes it has no idea what context it's being said in. This quote was from a discussion regarding the specific logistics around the Red Army leaving Eastern Germany during the process of German reunification. And Baker promised that US troops would not immediately pour across into Eastern Europe to replace the Red Army troops. If you don't believe me, why don't we just listen to what Mikhail Gorbachev says?
Heute fragt man mich, warum es nicht vertraglich fixiert wurde, dass die NATO sich nicht nach Osten ausdehnen darf. Dazu sollte man Folgendes berücksichtigen. Damals existierte die NATO und der Warschauer Pakt. Was sollte man da vertraglich fixieren? Die Frage stellte sich damals gar nicht.
Das heißt, es ist ein Mythos, dass Sie vom Westen bezüglich der NATO-Osterweiterung betrogen wurden?
Ja, das ist tatsächlich ein Mythos.
Grievance 3. The 2014 revolution was a US-backed coup. This one really annoys me. The Maidan Revolution of 2014 was a series of massive public protests across Ukraine that lasted for 93 days and nights in the middle of winter, confronting incredibly violent police. There were consistently crowds of up to 800,000 people. They were not paid actors. 108 protesters lost their lives. This was a nation standing up to a president who had promised to carry out the institutional reforms necessary for Ukraine to be accepted into the EU, but instead cut a deal with Putin. Viktor Yanukovych was ridiculously corrupt. His son became one of the richest men in Ukraine under his rule, but he wasn't removed by the military or even by any other kind of physical force. It was his heavy-handed use of security forces against protesters that turned the majority of Ukrainian people against him, but it was a parliamentary vote to remove him from power. He then chose to flee Moscow because he knew he was probably going to be investigated for fraud. There was an amazing news footage of Ukrainians getting their first glimpse of this insanely opulent presidential palace after he left. Yes, the US and the West gave public support to the political leaders they thought would be most likely to be pro-Western. But that doesn't make this incredible act of political liberation any less real or any less brave. And that phone call that everyone uses involving the US diplomat Victoria Nuland, that the Russians taped, by the way, where she discusses who the best person to take over is. She says, I think Yats is the guy. She's talking about one of the main opposition figures to Viktor Yanukovych, named Arseniy Yatsenyuk. Now, in that call, Nuland argued that he had far more governing and economic experience than other opposition figures, so was the best option to lead Ukraine going forward. And not long after that phone call, the Ukraine's parliament voted 371-0 to appoint Yatsenyuk as prime minister, a position he held until 2016. But he was also the former foreign minister and a speaker of parliament. He was the obvious choice for the Ukrainian parliament to choose. This wasn't the US hand-picking the Ukrainian president. It was a US diplomat discussing with a colleague on who would be the best to lead parliament after they voted to remove Yanukovych. But honestly, If you genuinely think this incredible political movement was some kind of US-backed coup, just watch the documentary on Netflix, Winter on Fire. It's a remarkable documentary. See the conviction and hope in their eyes. See what they sacrificed for even just the hope of a political system so many of us take for granted. And imagine how it must feel for them to know that there are countless people who simply deny what they did or dismiss them as CIA agents. Since Putin launched his full-scale invasion in 2022, I have read time and time again about these young Ukrainian men and women who risked everything to liberate their nation from a Kremlin puppet in 2014, only to have since been killed by Putin's counterattack 8 years later, committed to erasing the cause they committed their life to. This is why this one annoys me so much. Listening to fools born into political privilege ignorantly betray the valor of those that sacrificed everything for democracy. It's truly one of the cruelest aspects of this disinformation. Grievance 4. Genocide in the Donbass. Yes, there are a lot of Russian speakers in Ukraine the same way there are a lot of English speakers in Ireland. Ukraine has been occupied by Russians for centuries. If you wanted a senior government or industry job, you needed to speak Russian, and there are just also a lot of ethnic Russians there now. Straight after the 2014 revolution, Russian soldiers emerged in Crimea and eastern Ukrainian regions known as the Donbass. They were purporting to be locals despite being fully armed soldiers in camouflage, and they demanded that these regions now be annexed by Mother Russia. These soldiers formed militias with local pro-Russian militants and began a conflict with Ukrainian soldiers. Now, if you don't believe me, again, here is Igor Girkin, the FSB agent, which is essentially the Russian CIA, who was tasked with kicking this whole thing off.
Приписывают вам следующие слова, которым вы охарактеризовали конфликт на Украине. Спусковой крючок войны все-таки нажал я. Если бы наш отряд не перешел границу, в итоге все бы кончилось как в Харькове, как в Одессе. Было бы несколько десятков убитых, обожженных, арестованных. На этом бы и кончилось.
Это мои слова, я их сказал про Ханова еще в 2014 году, да. И в принципе в них содержится правда. Я говорил то, что считаю правдой. Действительно, если бы наш отряд не пришел на Донбасс и не стал бы ядром сопротивления, ядром русской весны на Донбассе, то, скорее всего, без этого ядра русская весна была бы подавлена в Западе.
Now, it was during these ensuing battles that the alleged genocide has occurred, with the Ukrainian army being accused by the Kremlin of relentlessly shelling the cities in the region to the point that known humanitarian President Vladimir Putin could no longer bear to sit and do nothing. So how many actually died in the Donbass between 2014 and 2022? Well, the UN believes the figure is about 14,400, and that's a lot, sure, but from that, at least 4,400 were Ukrainian soldiers, and about 6,500 were pro-Russian militants, many of whom, as I just explained, were actually Russian soldiers. The UN believes that a total of 3,404 civilians died during that conflict in the Donbass. Now, every one of those deaths is tragic, but it's also not a genocide. These are deaths that occur when civilians find themselves in a war zone, a war that the Russians started. Now, there is absolutely no evidence that the Ukrainian army has at any stage targeted civilians. There is, however, significant evidence of pro-Russian separatists murdering pro-Ukrainian civilians. It's important to also note that these figures of civilian casualties include the 298 civilians who were killed when Russian militants shot down a passenger plane, MH17, in 2014. 38 Australians were among the dead there. It's also worth observing that the majority of the civilian deaths occurred in 2014 and 2015, yet Putin decided that it was not until 2022 that there was an emergency that could only be resolved by military conquest. Now, again, if you don't believe me, how about the former head of Wagner, Yevgeny Prigozhin, before his plane was shot out of the sky?
Ничего сверхординарного не было. Сейчас уже Министерство обороны пытается обмануть общественность, пытается обмануть президента и рассказать историю о том, что со стороны Украины была безумная агрессия. И они собирались вместе со всем блоком НАТО на нас напасть. Поэтому спецоперация, так называемая 24 февраля, она была начата совершенно по другим.
Because of his disastrous decision to launch this war, around 500,000 people are now dead. Countless more are physically and emotionally scarred. A whole generation of Russian and Ukrainian men have been traumatized from a horrific new form of warfare. He needs to own that. The reason he started this war is simple. Ukraine becoming a prosperous liberal democracy following a popular uprising that overthrew a corrupt kleptocrat is far too dangerous an example to tolerate in a country so culturally and geographically close to Russia. If the Ukrainian people could shake free from their oligarchs, what's stopping the Russian people from getting the same silly idea? Putin needs to crush the hope of the Ukrainian people before that hope contaminates the population he has spent a quarter of a century breaking in. He sees this as an existential war for him personally. He fears being the next Gaddafi, Saddam Hussein, or Nicolae Ceausescu. He is terrified that his constituents will ever believe that he can be defeated. Yet, by picking a fight with the wrong people, by failing to comprehend just how strong their convictions are, and underestimating how committed Europe would be, he's never looked so weak. So please, stop peddling his lies, stop blaming the victims, and recognize for a moment that the world Putin is trying to establish is a threat to all of us, including you. So stop helping him.